They called it a rescue. He experienced it as a second capture. But long before anyone even used those words, Billy was just a boy trying to exist at the edge of the American frontier, where every day was measured by sun, wind, and the fragile rhythm of survival. No one in the world had yet assigned him a story. He had no destiny to fulfill, no medals waiting in a drawer, no prophecy whispered to the wind. He had only the dust beneath his feet, the sun beating down on his neck, and a family that clung desperately to their patch of earth as though the land owed them mercy. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe for more like it. Now, back to the story. Texas in the mid-1800s was not the tidy, expansive state that history books often make it out to be. It was raw, incomplete, violent. Every mile of land was contested. Maps shifted as quickly as fortunes, and treaties were nothing more than ink on paper, signed by men who had no intention of living with the consequences. Billy's family lived on a farm far from neighbors, surrounded by stretches of open prairie that offered beauty and danger in equal measure. The nearest house might be miles away, and the nearest help even farther. In this world, children were not spared responsibility. They were trained early to notice, to anticipate, to act. They carried water, tended animals, watched crops, and learned to walk lightly, yet always remain alert. People would later call boys like Billy innocent, but that word feels almost dishonest when describing life on the frontier. These children saw what adults tried to forget. They heard tales of burned homesteads, missing families, and violent confrontations that left scars across the land. They observed the aftermath of raids, the smoldering remains of cabins, and the terrified expressions of travelers who had come too close to conflict. But even with all this, they could not know timing. Danger did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived like weather, sudden, unavoidable, and often lethal. And history, as always, preserves only fragments. It rarely tells us the exact morning that marked the end of innocence. Billy's morning began like any other. Perhaps he was carrying water, or checking the fences, or trailing the horses grazing near the edge of the woods. The air might have been warm, with the faint tang of dew on the grass. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grasses, carrying with it scents of distant smoke and livestock. And then it came, horses thundering across the land, moving faster than any boy could run. The sound arrived first, a pounding, a rush, a roar that shattered the fragile calm. Warriors appeared, moving with uncanny speed and precision, like shadows sliding across the earth. Adults shouted, children screamed. Chaos replaced quiet in an instant. Billy did not escape. He felt the hands grip him, rough and insistent, yanking him from the ground. His body was lifted, thrown across a horse, and carried away from everything he had known. In that moment, the world he understood ceased to exist. No goodbyes, no farewell glances. History remembers it only in fragments. A boy taken, a family left behind, a landscape forever changed. And yet, for Billy, the capture was only the beginning. Survival demanded endurance, shelter, comfort, explanation. These came later, if at all. At first, there was only motion, uncertainty, and the harsh reality of being carried into a life that did not belong to him. Marching through the land, barefoot, often hungry, constantly watched, Billy quickly understood the rules of this new world. Any sign of defiance, weakness, or hesitation could end in punishment, or worse. The tribes who took captives were not cruel for cruelty's sake. Their logic was rooted in survival. A child who could not keep pace endangered everyone. A misstep could cost lives. Billy's fear sharpened into instinct. He learned when to move, when to remain still, when to speak, and when silence was the only safety. The earth itself became a teacher. The heat burning his skin, the stones cutting his feet, the cold of nights that seemed endless. He learned quickly, because failure was never an option. Names, too, became fluid. Billy's birth name faded as the tribe gave him a new one, a word spoken in another language, carrying meaning tied to his appearance or character. The boy who answered to Billy disappeared, replaced by a child whose hair, clothing, diet, and daily rituals were entirely different. English words began to lose relevance, their meanings slipping away as new words shaped new thoughts, new perceptions, new understandings of the world. He learned the rhythm of this language not from a teacher's gentle hand, but from necessity. Understanding commands, warnings, and stories could mean the difference between life and death. Billy's education in this new world was harsh but complete. He learned to ride as the tribe rode, to fall and rise without hesitation, to observe tracks, to read the land, to know where not to step, when not to speak. Discipline was strict. Belonging, however, was genuine. Unlike the threat of punishment, the inclusion in daily tasks, hunts, and responsibilities taught him value, purpose, and identity. He was not a guest. He was a participant. Over time, he grew stronger, taller, faster, more capable than he had ever been in his settler life. The tribe no longer saw him as a captive. He was one of them, a contributor, a participant, a child shaped entirely by the rhythms of survival. The moment Billy was seized, the world he had known dissolved into motion, noise, and fear. Hands gripped him so tightly that his arms ached. Yet, he had no choice but to obey. He could barely comprehend the speed at which he was carried away from home, from the familiar scent of his family, from the fences and fields that had defined the edges of his small life. The prairie stretched endlessly around him, and yet now it felt foreign, dangerous, alive with unseen eyes and hidden threats. He rode with the warriors across plains that shimmered with heat. Dust choked the air, sticking to sweat on his face, mingling with tears he could not shed. Each beat of the horse's hooves struck like a drum in his chest, and the wind tore at his hair, flinging grass and grit into his eyes. The terrain changed constantly. Hills that slowed their pace, dry creek beds that threatened to trip the horses, thickets that ripped at skin and clothing. The journey felt endless, though it may have lasted only days. Each night they stopped, but not to rest fully. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and sleep was measured in moments snatched between vigilance and exhaustion. He learned that in this world, being alert was not optional, it was survival. Billy was not comforted. There were no soft words, no explanations of what was happening or why. Questions were dangerous. Hesitation could invite a strike. Children like him learned to move silently, to anticipate the unspoken rules, to read the smallest gestures of those around them. A hand raised, a glance, a twitch of muscle. These could mean safety or threat. Fear became a constant companion, but it was sharpened, honed into instinct. He began to notice patterns. Which animals meant danger, which sounds signaled movement in the distance, which paths were safer than others. His mind raced to understand, to adapt, to survive. The tribe's logic was merciless, but precise. Any child who lagged behind risked slowing the group, endangering everyone. Billy stumbled, fell, and scraped skin from rocks and roots, but he learned quickly to rise, to keep moving, to anticipate the next step. Nights were often colder than he could remember, the prairie offering little protection. Sometimes he was tied or pinned lightly, small stones pressing him to the ground so that attempts to flee could be stopped before they began. These measures were not cruelty. They were lessons encoded in fear. He was being taught the most vital skill there was: endurance. Billy's thoughts swirled constantly. Memories of home flickered and faded like firelight in a windstorm. Faces he loved, words he had spoken, the rhythm of his family's routines. These all seemed distant, almost irrelevant in the immediacy of movement, hunger, and vigilance. He had no choice but to surrender to the new rhythm of life, to the unspoken rules that governed every step and glance. His senses became sharper. He noticed the subtle scent of smoke in the distance, the tracks of animals, the shift of the wind that could carry sounds from miles away. Each observation had meaning. Each misstep could cost more than just embarrassment. It could mean death. The land itself became a teacher. Hills, rivers, and plains were no longer neutral. Each offered lessons in movement, caution, and survival. The heat of the day seared his skin. The cold of the night chilled his bones. He learned to drink from streams when he could, to ration food when it appeared, to sleep lightly, always ready to awaken at the first whisper of sound. The ground beneath him was not just earth. It was history, danger, and a constant test. He began to move instinctively, guided by a blend of fear, observation, and necessity. Survival was the only curriculum, and failure was not permitted. Language, too, shifted rapidly. English faded from relevance, replaced by words and sounds whose meanings were tied to immediate action and consequence. Commands, gestures, and tone replaced the gentle instructions of home. Billy had to learn quickly, for comprehension was survival. To misinterpret a direction, to hesitate, or to fail could invite punishment. And yet, there was no cruelty for cruelty's sake. Everything served purpose. Obedience was survival. Understanding was life. Adaptation was the only path forward. Billy was not alone in his struggle, though he often felt isolated. Other captives and children had experienced similar fates. He observed them carefully, learning their habits, noting how they moved, spoke, and survived. Some adapted faster, some slower, some faltered entirely. By watching, by imitating, by internalizing the rhythm of the group, he strengthened his own chances. And slowly, the boy who had been thrown from home began to merge with the pulse of the tribe, not yet fully, but enough to endure the days and nights that threatened to crush him. Even amid this new life, moments of raw terror remained. A sudden cry in the night, a misstep in the brush, the flash of a distant figure, all reminded him of fragility, of how precarious existence had become. And yet, through endurance, observation, and instinct, Billy survived. Each day, each mile, each night spent under stars or near fire honed him. He became more than a boy carried along by circumstance. He began to embody the rhythms, the vigilance, and the resilience required to endure this brutal, unfamiliar world. Billy's world shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. He woke to the same sounds: wind in the grass, distant animals, the murmur of conversation in a language he was only beginning to understand. But now those sounds carried meaning. Each whisper, each gesture, each subtle movement was a signal. He learned to notice them, to interpret them, to act. Survival demanded not just endurance, but comprehension, anticipation, and adaptability. What had once been chaos became a structured, demanding rhythm that he could follow if he paid attention. The first weeks were the hardest. He struggled to remember which words carried action and which carried warning, which gestures were instruction and which were reprimand. A single mistake could draw a sharp hand, a barked order, or an intense look that burned into memory. Slowly, his body and mind adjusted. Muscle memory and instinct began to supplement conscious thought. He learned to mount a horse quickly, to balance with subtle shifts of weight, to ride at speeds that once terrified him. He discovered that movement was language, that the way a rider leaned or braced could communicate more than words ever could. Food, too, became a lesson in observation and patience. He learned to recognize which plants were safe, which roots could be eaten raw, which animals were hunted for meat, and which avoided. Meals were never plentiful. Each morsel demanded respect. Wasting food was unthinkable. He learned to drink only when water appeared, to chew slowly, to swallow carefully, to appreciate the satisfaction of being sated without indulgence. Hunger became familiar, a companion rather than a tormentor, and he learned that satisfaction was fleeting, always temporary. The discipline of appetite became discipline of mind. Hunting became more than survival. It became a ritual of observation and skill. Billy followed older boys and men into forests, across plains and along riverbeds. He learned to track footprints that seemed meaningless to the untrained eye, to notice broken twigs, disturbed grasses, and the faintest scent in the air. Birds became messengers, the rustle of small mammals a warning. Every step, every glance, every pause was a test of attentiveness. Mistakes could cost the prey, and occasionally, in tense moments, the hunter's safety. He learned to move silently, to position himself in shadows, to anticipate motion before it happened. The land itself spoke, and Billy began to understand its language. Language reshaped his thinking. English faded almost entirely. The new words ordered reality differently. Directions were given relative to land features, not arbitrary coordinates. Time was measured by the sun, by the behavior of animals, by the subtle changes in weather. Commands carried nuance and expectation. Humor had its own rhythm, often linked to shared experience rather than abstract ideas. He realized that thinking itself could be guided by environment, that cognition was flexible, and that survival required constant adjustment. The boy who once thought in straight lines now began to think in patterns, in cycles, in flow. Riding with the tribe on hunts and eventually raids introduced moral and emotional complexity. At first, Billy observed, watching as others moved, attacked, and survived. The first time he was expected to participate fully, the weight of expectation pressed against him like stone. He carried weapons not as punishment, but as proof of readiness. He learned to follow orders without hesitation, to anticipate the needs of the group, to act decisively. Each action carried consequence. Each failure could jeopardize others. Fear was no longer a purely internal sensation. It was shared, distributed, managed. He learned the art of controlled panic, the way adrenaline sharpened senses, while the mind remained calm enough to make the correct choice. Yet there were moments of unexpected clarity, of connection, of learning that went beyond survival. He discovered companionship in other boys, understanding in elders, the subtle humor of shared effort. Laughter became rare, precious and meaningful. Songs, stories, and quiet moments around the fire taught lessons that discipline alone could not convey. He began to understand that belonging was earned not by birthright, but by participation, observation, and contribution. Respect was demonstrated through action, not demanded by title. Billy's physical transformation mirrored his mental one. His body grew stronger and leaner, conditioned by long days of riding, hunting, and constant vigilance. Bruises, cuts, and burns became badges of experience, each one a memory of challenge faced and overcome. Endurance was second nature. His muscles remembered the movements that his mind had not yet fully comprehended. He could ride for hours without fatigue, track animals through varied terrain, and navigate paths invisible to anyone not attuned to the land. His reflexes sharpened, his senses heightened, and he began to feel at home in a world that had once terrified him. The tribe, for its part, began to rely on him. Tasks once reserved for older boys were given to him, responsibilities that tested his judgment, agility, and loyalty. He was expected to hunt, to guard, to scout, to respond to threats. Each task taught subtle lessons in leadership, observation, and ethics. He learned to consider not just immediate survival, but the well-being of the group. Morality became situational. What endangered others could not be permitted, even if the act itself felt wrong according to the rules he had known as a child. He learned to compartmentalize, to focus on what needed to be done, to understand the balance between instinct and duty. Even as he adapted, he carried the shadow of his previous life. Memories surfaced unexpectedly. Smells, sounds, the feel of a wooden fence under his hands. But they were no longer anchors. They were faint echoes, faint reminders of a world he could no longer fully inhabit. And yet, those memories never completely disappeared. They shaped his reflection, his understanding of both worlds. He began to comprehend that identity was not fixed, that survival could transform a child into someone entirely new. The boy who had been Billy of the settlers was gone, but he lived on in the careful observation, the instinctive reactions, and the disciplined, thoughtful movements of the young man he was becoming. As the months turned to years, Billy began to feel the full weight of living between two worlds. Outwardly, he was part of the tribe, riding alongside hunters, tending animals, participating in rituals, and responding to commands without hesitation. But inside, questions and doubts stirred constantly. He began to notice that his actions, even when instinctive, carried moral weight. Taking part in hunts, tracking, or even raids forced him to confront consequences he had never faced as a settler child. Each choice became a test not only of survival, but of conscience. At first, the distinctions were confusing. Violence was not abstract. It was immediate. When a deer fell, the act of hunting was survival and sustenance, but also responsibility. When settlers were encountered during raids, the line between enemy and human blurred in his mind. He had once been one of those settlers. Children screamed as he now did, and adults shouted as he had once run. Each mirrored moment created a strange symmetry that he could neither ignore nor resolve fully. Billy began to understand that survival required compartmentalization, not the absence of empathy, but the careful management of it. One could care and still act decisively. One could be human and yet functional in a world that demanded relentless efficiency. Sleep brought reflection and confusion. Nights by the fire offered a brief pause from constant alertness, but they also allowed thoughts of home to creep back in. Faces of family, the smell of their small farm, the wooden floors of the cabin, all seemed distant and unreal. Memories clashed with his present reality. The boy who had clung to the settler world now found himself fascinated by the logic of the tribe, by the patterns of the land, by the rituals of survival. How could both worlds coexist in one mind? How could he reconcile the instinctive loyalty he felt toward those who had raised him with the faint, lingering identity he carried from birth? Billy's first full participation in a raid marked a turning point. The event was not ceremonious. There were no speeches, no promises. Expectation alone demanded action. He rode alongside hunters, tracking movement, anticipating responses, carrying weapons that had once terrified him. The first time he had to make a split-second decision, to follow a command or to hesitate, his heart pounded in a way he would never forget. Hesitation could cost lives, yet instinct had not yet fully mastered the rhythm of decision. When the moment passed and nothing was lost, a strange satisfaction emerged. He realized that morality in this life was intimately tied to skill and timing. Acting correctly meant survival. Acting poorly could end existence, for oneself or for the group. That truth settled deep within him, reshaping his understanding of right and wrong. Observation became a tool not just for survival, but for understanding the tribe itself. He watched how elders judged actions, how leaders made decisions, how humor and storytelling reinforced norms. He learned that belonging was earned, yes, but it was also observed, tested, and constantly negotiated. One could never assume acceptance. It was granted moment by moment through competence, respect, and awareness. Failure, even small, was noticed and corrected immediately. This system was harsh, yet consistent, and Billy learned to internalize it, to allow the structure to guide him without stripping his own judgment entirely. At the same time, emotional complexity grew. He noticed the subtle bonds forming among children of the tribe, the way loyalty was expressed, the nuanced ways conflict was managed. He began to feel frustration, longing, and occasional regret. A fleeting thought of home could trigger an ache that lasted hours, yet returning mentally to his old life was impossible. The boy who had known security, however fragile, was gone. The boy who existed now understood danger, responsibility, and consequence in ways that far exceeded his age. Identity was no longer tied to birthplace. It was tied to experience, observation, and response. Each choice he made, each lesson absorbed, reshaped who he was fundamentally. Language played a pivotal role in his psychological transformation. English words, once his primary tools for thought, lost their resonance. Tribal language structured reality differently. Actions and observations were prioritized over abstract concepts. Descriptions were tied to the land, to immediate experience, to cause and effect relationships. Thought itself reorganized. He no longer measured time in hours or days, but in cycles, events, and environmental cues. Memory, too, adapted. Events were stored by consequence and lesson rather than chronological order. When he later encountered white society again, this shift in cognition would become a profound source of disorientation. Over time, Billy began to notice the unspoken moral codes that governed his new world. Every act, every decision carried layers of meaning. Stealing, lying, or hesitating could endanger the tribe. Kindness, observation, and quick judgment were rewarded silently, without praise, but with inclusion, trust, and responsibility. Understanding these subtle rules was as important as knowing how to ride, hunt, or track. Billy realized that culture was more than ritual or language. It was a web of consequences, expectations, and learned instinct. Absorbing it fully meant becoming part of something larger than himself, even while retaining fragments of his past self in quiet moments of reflection. The day soldiers arrived, the world Billy had known began to crumble. The movement of boots across the prairie, the sharp commands in English, the unfamiliar uniforms, they all signaled change, though no warning had preceded it. White men approached not as neighbors, not as friends, but as authority. To them, this was a rescue. To Billy, it was something entirely different, a second capture, a severing of the life he had learned to navigate and understand. The tribe that had raised him, that had taught him language, rhythm, and survival, now became the world he was being torn from. Clothing, buildings, and schedules all became instruments of discomfort. The loose garments and practical attire of the tribe were replaced by stiff shirts, shoes that pinched, and garments that restricted movement. Indoors, walls pressed around him, doors confined him. Tables dictated the rhythm of meals, and clocks dictated the rhythm of his life. Movement was no longer governed by instinct or environmental cues, but by arbitrary rules that often seemed inefficient, even dangerous, to a mind trained for constant vigilance. Every action required adjustment, every instinct questioned. Food was one of the first sources of tension. The abundance of meals confused him. Plates filled with unfamiliar arrangements, portions larger than needed, and food discarded for convenience, all struck him as wasteful, reckless, and almost offensive. Hunger, once a constant companion and teacher, had been replaced by excess. His stomach and instincts were at odds with the new world. Eating on a schedule rather than when the body demanded felt unnatural. He learned to swallow the discomfort silently, to appear compliant, while internally reconciling the inefficiency. Speech and social interaction were equally challenging. People expected explanations, gratitude, and politeness according to rules Billy had never internalized. Conversation felt padded and indirect, often filled with abstractions and irrelevant details. People asked questions he could not answer cleanly. Expressions of curiosity or judgment came in forms he did not recognize. A glance, a sigh, a tone of voice, all carried subtle meaning he had yet to decode. Silence, which had once been a protective tool and a sign of attention, was now read as stubbornness, ingratitude, or even emotional damage. Misinterpretation was constant. Frustration was inevitable. Billy moved differently now, his body remembering hours of riding, running, crouching, and balancing in ways that felt foreign indoors. He could not sit still. The stillness of chairs and rooms felt unnatural, almost suffocating. His gaze scanned constantly, seeking exits. Noting subtle changes in environment, assessing potential threats. The alertness that had ensured survival in the wild now made social engagement exhausting. His body acted before his mind could translate the signals of white society. Every step, every glance, every breath carried the imprint of the land he had lived in, the tribe that had raised him, and the instincts that had saved him countless times. Emotional dissonance grew in ways others could not understand. The relief his rescuers anticipated never arrived. Gratitude, they assumed, would follow naturally. Instead, Billy felt loss, displacement, and confusion. His identity, so carefully reconstructed over years, was being stretched and strained. The boy who had survived and adapted to the rhythm of the tribe was no longer entirely that boy, yet he had not returned to the child he had once been. He existed in a liminal space, belonging fully to neither world. Attempts at reintegration were met with mixed success. Some white families tried to teach him customs, social rules, and morality according to their worldview. Others disciplined him for perceived defiance or disinterest. Prayers and exhortations sought to remove the wildness they assumed he carried. None worked because Billy was not broken, he was transformed. His instincts, honed by necessity and observation, could not be erased. What they called stubbornness or rebellion was simply adaptation in another form, an intelligence shaped by survival, loyalty, and environmental awareness rather than by social convention. At night, Billy's mind often returned to the open spaces, to the rhythm of the tribe, to the quiet but profound rules of survival he had internalized. Stars overhead, wind across grass, the murmurs of conversation in a language he now remembered almost by instinct. These memories were vivid, grounding, and almost more real than the walls that surrounded him. Sleep was fitful. Movement was constrained. Freedom, once instinctual, had become a memory that he could no longer fully inhabit. Yet it persisted, a quiet reminder that the life he had learned was not lost, merely displaced. Even simple acts carried hidden tensions. Walking down a street, watching children play in ways he could not comprehend, observing adults ignoring subtle environmental cues. Every action and inaction clashed with his instincts. He understood dangers they could not see. Weather, terrain, animals, even the behavior of people around him. Safety was no longer a simple construct. It was relative, learned through experience, and misunderstood by those around him. The gap between his perception and theirs created isolation, yet also a profound awareness of life's fragility. Billy's silence became his shield. He spoke when necessary, but each word was measured, filtered, and deliberate. Observation replaced idle chatter. Understanding replaced assumptions. Relationships developed slowly, cautiously. Trust was no longer given. It was evaluated continuously based on consistency, action, and respect for his boundaries. The world demanded conformity, but Billy had learned adaptability. These two realities could coexist only with tension. He moved through white society like a shadow, present but not fully part, alert but not fully relaxed, observant but never entirely at ease. Billy's story does not end with a single dramatic moment. There is no grand reunion, no triumphant speech, no neatly recorded victory. Instead, his life drifts into the subtle, the quiet, the unnoticed. Years passed, seasons turned, and the world around him changed relentlessly. The frontier he had known, vast, fluid, alive, was slowly replaced by fences, towns, and the heavy weight of social expectation. Where once he had moved with instinct and freedom, he now navigated rules and structures that often seemed arbitrary, unnatural, or inefficient. Yet in this new world, he carried the lessons of the past with him: vigilance, adaptability, patience, observation, and the awareness that survival requires constant engagement with reality. Identity had become something far more complex than birthright or social designation. Billy had been shaped not by the labels others applied to him, but by experience. He understood danger, loyalty, and responsibility in ways few of his peers could. He knew that belonging was earned, that culture is not merely inherited, and that rescue can sometimes feel like removal. Every instinct, every habit, every measured glance bore the imprint of years spent attuned to a world that required constant awareness. These qualities made him unique, not because he was exceptional in the way society measures success, but because he had endured transformations that left him neither here nor there, yet fully alive in both realms. Observing others, he began to see the limitations of their perception. People acted as though comfort and order were universal measures of progress, but he understood a different truth. Motion, attention, and adaptation mattered more than comfort. Children who roamed freely, adults who observed carefully, weather that dictated action rather than abstract schedules. These were the realities that had taught him the deepest lessons. While those around him relied on routines and permanence, he had learned the fluidity of life, the subtle signals of nature, and the importance of response over prediction. That knowledge could not be undone, no matter how civilized the environment appeared. Billy's existence became a quiet testament to human adaptability. He had survived two worlds, one structured, one untamed, and had absorbed the strengths, skills, and insights of both. Yet he also carried the cost of survival, a lingering dislocation, the sense that no single society could claim him fully, and the quiet knowledge that belonging is never guaranteed, only earned. In him, the past and present intertwined, a living archive of endurance, observation, and transformation. Identity was no longer tied to names, places, or ceremonies. It was tied to memory, skill, and lived experience. History rarely records the lives of people like Billy. Victories, wars, leaders, and conflicts dominate written accounts, while the complex trajectories of children caught between worlds are often reduced to footnotes or fragments. Yet those fragments reveal profound truths. Billy's life demonstrates that culture is learned, that morality is situational, and that resilience requires both psychological and physical mastery. Children raised outside their birth society may not return whole in the conventional sense, but they carry forms of knowledge, insight, and survival that defy simple narratives. In this way, Billy embodies the human capacity for adaptation, illustrating lessons that no formal education could teach. Even in obscurity, his story resonates. By observing him, we learn about the frontier, about survival under pressure, about the costs of cultural displacement, and about the resilience of the human mind and body. He lived in tension, in a liminal space, and in doing so, illuminated the spaces between worlds that history often overlooks. The frontier did not simply test him, it transformed him, shaping instincts, ethics, and perceptions in ways that remained invisible to those around him. When the society that believed it was saving him imposed its norms, he adapted in silence, carrying the wisdom of lived experience that could not be erased. Billy's legacy is subtle but enduring. It is found in the quiet observation of nature, in the instinctive responses to danger, in the careful measurement of movement and consequence. It is in the understanding that identity is fluid, that culture is absorbed through survival and participation, and that belonging is earned, not inherited. His life defies simplistic narratives of captivity and rescue, civilization and wilderness. It reminds us that survival is not merely physical, it is intellectual, emotional, and cultural. The boy who once ran across the prairie, lifted into the unknown, had become a man who embodied the knowledge of two worlds simultaneously, carrying each within him with careful equilibrium. Perhaps most importantly, Billy teaches us that history does not always move linearly from chaos to order or from tragedy to triumph. Sometimes it moves sideways, leaving individuals stranded between eras, societies, or values. And sometimes the measure of a life is not in medals, records, or public recognition, but in the quiet mastery of adaptation, the courage to endure, and the insight that emerges from living fully even when belonging is impossible. He reminds us that identity is not static, that experience is transformative, and that survival, in its most honest form, carries with it complexity, contradiction, and enduring resilience. If Billy's story moved you, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell to explore more untold histories and stories of survival and resilience.